My name is Kelsey Morgan. I am 29 years old, and I have built my entire career designing the interiors of Chicago's most exclusive skyscrapers. I am an architect. I know exactly how much weight a structure can handle before it collapses. At 11:51 p.m., my own foundation gave way. A text from my mother, Jessica, flashed on my screen. "You're not coming to the wedding." A minute later, my father, Gary, added, "The Hendersons do not want a technical staff member ruining the atmosphere." I stood in my office, surrounded by the blueprints I had spent my deepest passion perfecting for my sister Brooke. I was good enough to build her world, but not good enough to inhabit it. Have you ever felt like you're invisible in your own family? Please share your story in the comments below. Just like right now, I'm out for a drive to find some peace of mind. What about you? Where are you watching from? And what time is it there? I'd love to connect with you. I did not cry. I did not ask why. Architecture has taught me that when a beam is rotten, you do not try to paint over it, you remove it. This was not a family crisis, it was a breach of contract. I rubbed my eyes, trying to summon a single drop of sadness, but there was only clarity. This was not a breakdown, it was a balance sheet. I sat down at my desk, the cool glow of the monitors reflecting off my glasses. I was not a daughter right now. I was the chief executive officer of Kelsey Morgan Design Studio. I logged into the project management portal and pulled up the file for the Morgan Henderson penthouse. It was a masterpiece of luxury, a $3 million interior I had designed for my sister, Brooke, as a wedding gift. I had leveraged every industry contact I had to secure the best materials, and I had personally fronted the $250,000 deposit for the custom Italian marble and the hand-carved cabinetry. My parents had told me they would pay me back when things settled down, a phrase they had been using to overdraft my compassion for years. Anger was not loud this time. It was clinical. If I was just technical staff to them, then I would behave like a professional. I clicked on the vendor management tab. One by one, I issued formal cancellation notices. The vendors didn't answer to Brooke. They answered to the person who held the master service agreement. Because every contract was signed under my firm's name, that $250,000 deposit wasn't a gift anymore. It was corporate credit. With one click, I reallocated those assets to the National Museum expansion project I was handling. My family had built their entire status climbing fantasy on the assumption that I would be their silent investor forever. They had normalized my exploitation for over 20 years. To them, my talent and my hard-earned capital were just free utilities, like water or air. They did not see the person. They only saw the resource. They were so focused on climbing the Henderson social ladder that they did not realize who was holding the ladder up. This is the trap of normalized cruelty. When you are too reliable, people stop seeing your sacrifice and start seeing it as their right. By 12:00 to 3 a.m., the gift was gone. I hit the final confirm button and watched the status bar turn red. Brooke would not be walking into a dream penthouse after her honeymoon. She would be walking into an empty concrete shell with bare wires hanging from the ceiling. I leaned back in my chair and watched the city lights of Chicago. For the first time in my life, the silence did not make me feel small. It made me feel in control. This was not revenge, it was accounting, and the Morgan family was officially out of credit. I opened a file on my cloud drive titled Emotional Debt. It was more than a folder, it was an autopsy of my past 4 years. While most architects build structures out of steel and glass, I had spent nearly a decade building a sanctuary for a family that did not even want me in the blueprints. I stared at the rows of numbers, each one a ledger entry of my own erasure. I'd been the silent investor in their version of a happy family, footing the bill for a lifestyle they could not afford on their own. There it was, in black and white, $12,000 to cover my father Gary's failed business venture 2 years ago. He had called it a loan, but I never saw a cent of it back. There were $45,000 for Brooke's marketing degree, and the influencer wardrobe she claimed was necessary for her image. I had been working 80-hour weeks at the studio, designing skyscrapers for strangers, just so my sister could live a highlight reel existence. I realize now that love in the Morgan household was not a bond, it was a subscription service, and I was the only one paying the monthly fee. The memory of the wine tasting with the Hendersons months ago felt like a phantom limb pain. We were at a private table in downtown Chicago, the kind of place where the silence is as expensive as the vintage. I sat at the far end, the technical consultant who had secured the reservation, and the architect who was designing their new penthouse for free, Mrs. Henderson had looked past me to my mother, Jessica, and said, "It is so helpful to have a daughter who knows her way around a budget. It must be a relief to have Grace. Kelsey, handle the messy details." My own mother had not corrected her. She just sipped her Cabernet and nodded. I paid the $1,800 bill that night. I was good enough to sign the receipt, but I was not worth the breath it took to say my name correctly. I knew people would wonder why I stayed so long, why I let them overdraft my compassion until I was spiritually bankrupt. The truth is, I was caught in the invisible chain of a survivor. When you grow up in a home where your only value is your utility, you stop being a daughter and start being a tool. I grew up in a house where Brooke was the star and I was the stagehand. I had been conditioned to believe that if I just worked a little harder, stayed a little later, or paid one more bill, I would finally earn a seat at the table I had set. But you cannot buy respect from people who only see you as an automated teller machine. The spreadsheet did not lie. My compassion had been a luxury they had been abusing for years, and tonight, I was closing the account. I hit the share button, sending a link to that ledger to the entire family group chat. I wanted them to see the exact cost of my absence. I wanted them to realize that the penthouse, the wardrobe, and the status they were so desperate to protect were all built on a foundation of my labor. And as of 12:0 to 3 a.m., that foundation had been demolished. The vibrations from my phone started at 3 a.m. and did not stop until the sun began to bleed through the Chicago fog. It sat on my granite countertop, a buzzing, frantic insect that I refused to swat. I did not need to look at the screen to know what was happening. The digital pulse of my family's panic was a rhythm I had memorized long ago. My sister, Brooke, would be leading the charge, her highlight reel life suddenly missing its most expensive frame. Then would come my mother, Jessica, with the emotional shrapnel, followed by my father, Gary, with the heavy-handed demands for order. I stood by the window, watching the early morning commuters on Wacker Drive. I felt a strange, cold detachment. Anger was not loud this time. It was a quiet, architectural survey of a structure that was no longer safe to inhabit. My phone lit up again. I finally picked it up. 34 missed calls. 58 text messages. The first one from Brooke, at 1:14 a.m., simply said, "Kelsey, what the hell did you do? The marble contractor just called. He said the order for the kitchen island was canceled. Tell me this is a glitch." I scrolled through the vitriol. At 2:0 to 5 a.m., she had escalated. "You are a psychopath. You are literally trying to ruin my life because you are jealous that I am marrying a Henderson and you are still alone in that studio. Fix this now or do not bother ever calling yourself a Morgan again." I did not feel the sting I used to. The word Morgan had always been a weight, a heavy iron chain I wore around my neck in the hopes it would eventually turn into an embrace. Now, it just felt like a name on a legal document I was prepared to shred. My mother's approach was more calculated. She did not text at first. She went straight to the court of public opinion. I opened Facebook and saw it, the classic distressed matriarch post. "Some people forget the hands that fed them," she had written, accompanied by a picture of a wilting rose. It breaks my heart when selfishness outweighs 29 years of love and sacrifice. Praying for our family during this difficult time, the comments were already filling up with her friends, offering hugs and calling me an ungrateful daughter without even knowing my name. It was a masterclass in gaslighting. They were not shocked by what they had done to me. They were shocked that I had stopped playing the role of the invisible safety net. To them, my selfishness was simply my refusal to be a human bank account for their delusions of grandeur. I watched the typing dots on the group chat appear again. It was my father. "Kelsey, I do not know what game you are playing, but you are embarrassing your mother. The Hendersons are asking questions. Move the money back?" We will discuss your feelings after the honeymoon. This is not the time for a tantrum. A tantrum. That was their word for a boundary. They had mistaken my years of strategic silence for a lack of self-worth. They thought the invisible chain of the survivor would always keep me tethered to their whims. They believed that because I had endured their dismissal for 29 years, I would endure it for 30 more. But they had forgotten one fundamental rule of engineering. Every material has a breaking point, and once a structure has reached its ultimate limit, there is no going back to the way it was. I called Marcus. He was not just a friend. He was the head of legal for my studio and a specialist in asset protection. We met in a quiet corner of a glass-walled conference room overlooking the loop. He did not offer a hug or a platitude. He placed a thick leather portfolio on the table. The intellectual property reclamation notice is drafted, he said, his voice as neutral as a concrete slab. As of this morning, any use of your designs for the Henderson penthouse is a criminal violation of your copyright. The demand for the $57,000 wasn't a request. It was an enforcement of the formal promissory notes my father had signed over the years, never imagining I would actually call them in. It was not about the money anymore. It was about the structural integrity of my life. For years, I had allowed my family to build their happiness on my stress. Now, I was shifting the load. Send it, I said. And make sure the courier delivers it directly to my father's office. Marcus tapped a separate, thinner file. There is one more thing you need to see, Kelsey. He flipped the page to show the logo for the Henderson Development Group. My breath hitched. These were the people my sister was marrying into. They've been bidding for a partnership with our studio for the past 3 weeks, Marcus explained. They want us to handle the interior architecture for their new billion-dollar skyscraper project in the North Quarter. They've been begging for a meeting with the brilliant mind behind the Morgan studio. The irony was a cold, sharp blade. To my parents and Brooke, I was technical staff, a convenient tool to be hidden in the background of their filtered photos. But to the billion-dollar empire they were trying so hard to impress, I was the gatekeeper. I was a talent they were willing to pay millions to secure. The Hendersons did not know that the invisible daughter they had helped exile was the same woman who held the future of their largest investment in her hands. Marcus did not look up from his screen for a long time. The only sound in the office was the low hum of the cooling system and the distant, rhythmic thud of a construction crew down on Michigan Avenue. He finally turned the monitor toward me, his expression as unreadable as a blueprint. We were looking for assets to reclaim, he said, his voice flat and clinical. But we found a liability instead. He zoomed in on a digital copy of a withdrawal slip from 3 months ago. It was a $50,000 transfer from the retirement account I had established in my name for my mother, Jessica. There was a signature at the bottom. It was my name, written in a shaky, practiced hand. But I had not signed a single document for that account in years. I leaned in, the pixels of the forgery blurring before my eyes. My father, Gary, had always been a man of shortcuts, but this was a dead end. The bank flagged the mismatch during the audit we triggered, Marcus continued, tapping the screen. They were going to call you directly, but it looks like your father had the contact information redirected to his business office. He had remained a joint signatory on that specific legacy account since my early startup days, a legal tether I had foolishly neglected to sever, giving him just enough shadow to bypass the two-factor alerts. He did not just steal money. He forged my identity to rob his own wife's future. It was a $50,000 bet on my continued silence, a gamble that I would never look closely at the numbers because I was too busy keeping the family afloat. I felt a wave of what should have been shock, but instead, it was just the final piece of a structural failure fitting into place. This is the silent regret of the watcher, the person who stands guard at the door, so the people inside never have to feel the cold. For years, I had been the guardian of their comfort, watching their bad decisions, and quietly shoring up the walls before they could collapse and hurt anyone. I had been so consumed with being their unseen project manager that I forgot the most basic rule of site safety. Never trust the people who benefit from your silence. I did not regret the $50,000. I regretted the decade I had spent thinking my vigilance was an act of love, when it was actually just a subsidy for their crimes. I was a sentry for a fortress that was already hollow. Marcus watched me, waiting for a breakdown that was not coming. "What do you want to do, Kelsey?" he asked. "This is no longer a family dispute. This is a felony." I adjusted my watch, the metal cool against my wrist. "Call the Chicago Police Department," I said. "If my father wants to live in a world built on fraud, he can start by doing it in a cell." My voice was as steady as a level line. I was not being cruel. I was being an architect. When a structure is built on a foundation of theft, you do not try to patch the cracks. You let the law demolish it. Everything in my head was calm, factual, and lethal. The wedding was 48 hours away. My family was busy arguing over floral centerpieces and the optics of the guest list, completely unaware that the police were about to become the most important part of the ceremony. I was not a technical staff member anymore. I was the person holding the arrest warrant. The National Museum Hall was supposed to be a sanctuary of history, but that Saturday, it was a graveyard of aesthetics. I had reclaimed the backbone of the event, and the body that remained was skeletal and shivering. There was no custom marble kitchen island for the cake, no hand-carved cabinetry for the bar, and no $100,000 lighting rigs to hide the flaws in the room. I had issued the reclamation notices 48 hours ago, and the result was a scene of clinical devastation. To save face, my parents had scrambled to hire a cut-rate, last-minute catering crew. The expensive vintage champagne was being served from plastic-topped folding tables, a pathetic makeshift setup that looked like a high school cafeteria trying to impersonate a gala. Guests in $5,000 suits were perched on rented plastic chairs, their champagne glasses sweating under the harsh, flickering overhead fluorescence I had left on specifically for this moment. The hall wasn't a ruin, but it was a hollow, industrial shell. Without the custom acoustics and warm lighting layers I had canceled, the vast space felt cold and exposed, stripping away the filtered illusion of grandeur. She looked gorgeous in her filtered photos, but here, in the cold light of reality, every muscle in her face was screaming under the strain. My parents were flanking her. My mother Jessica's smile sprayed on as tight as her hair, while my father Gary paced with a phone that I knew was vibrating with calls from creditors he could not pay. They had tried to fake it, but you cannot fake structural integrity. I walked in just as the officiant was clearing his throat for the vows. I was not wearing a bridesmaid dress, and I certainly was not there to celebrate. I was wearing a charcoal suit and the same lethal precision I used to close multi-million-dollar contracts. I had provided the district attorney's office with proof of my father's intent to flee to a non-extradition country the following morning, a flight risk that turned a white-collar crime into an immediate intervention. I was not alone. 2 detectives from the Chicago Police Department walked 3 steps behind me, their heavy boots thudding rhythmically on the concrete. "Kelsey, what are you doing here?" Brooke's voice echoed through the hollow room, shrill and desperate. The microphone was still on, and her panic rippled through the 300 guests. I did not stop until I was standing directly in front of my father. I did not look at the flowers or the mismatched centerpieces. I just handed him a manila envelope, not a wedding card, but a formal notification of a felony fraud investigation. "I am just doing what Mom asked," I said, my voice flat and carrying to the very back of the hall. "I am keeping this day drama-free by letting the professionals handle the criminal details." I pulled up the withdrawal slip on my phone, the one with the $50,000 forgery, and held it out so the Hendersons could see it. I watched the Hendersons' faces shift from confusion to a profound, icy disgust. This was the moment the illusion of power from an empty wallet finally shattered. My family had spent years believing that if they just acted the part, the status would follow. They thought they could use my labor and my money to buy a seat at a table where they did not belong. But their power was a facade built on my credit and my designs. They were sitting in a kingdom made of sand, and I had just let the tide in. When the resource logged out, there was nothing left but 2 people who had forged a signature to subsidize their own erasure. Mr. Henderson did not even wait for my father to find his voice. He looked at the detectives, then at my sister, and finally at his son. "We are done here," he said, his voice as sharp as a gavel. "I do not associate my family's name with fraud." Daniel did not argue. He looked at Brooke, really looked at her for the first time, and then he turned and walked toward the exit. I stood there, calm and factual, watching the Morgan family's ladder fall exactly as I had calculated. The industrial fans in the National Museum Hall were still humming when I walked out of the side door, leaving the wreckage of my family's social ambitions behind me. The cold Chicago wind off the lake hit me, but for the first time in my life, it did not make me shiver. It made me feel awake. I stood at the railing of the Riverwalk, watching the black water churn, and felt a weight dissolve that I had not even known I was carrying. I had spent 29 years being the invisible mortar holding their crumbling house together. Today, I finally stopped being the glue and started being the architect of my own life. Everything stayed silent for days, but it was not the suffocating silence of being ignored. It was the silence of a clean slate. My bank account eventually registered the return of my deposits, plus the legal restitution for the $50,000 my father had forged. But the numbers on the screen were not the victory. The victory was the October summit at the National Museum, where I stood on the stage I had designed, looking out at a crowd of people who respected my work not as a hobby, but as a standard for the industry. I used the money I recovered to establish the Bright Line Foundation. It is a fund dedicated to protecting young designers and architects who are being exploited by the very people who are supposed to protect them. I wanted to make sure no one else had to spend a decade paying for a seat at a table they already owned. I have come to realize that some people will only ever love you as long as you are useful to them. To my family, I was not a daughter or a sister. I was a subscription service they had been using to fund their highlight reel lives. But love is not a business transaction, and loyalty should not be a one-way street. If you find yourself in a similar situation, remember that boundaries are not acts of cruelty. They are the ultimate acts of self-respect. This message is for those of you who have always felt like you were standing on the edge of your own family, to the ones who were the stagehands while their siblings were the stars, to those who have been the silent investors in someone else's happiness while your own needs were treated as a distraction. I want you to know that you are not crazy for feeling the cold. You are not a burden for having a breaking point. Forgiveness is not always about the other person. Sometimes it is the only way to set yourself free from the blueprints they wrote for you. You are allowed to walk away from people who only call when the building is on fire. You are allowed to log out. Do not ever build a palace on land owned by people who refuse to acknowledge you are the one who laid the bricks. If the story of Kelsey Morgan has given you the courage to say no to exploitation, please hit like and subscribe. Share this story if you believe that self-respect is the most valuable inheritance we can leave behind. I will see you at the next Design for a Life built on your own terms.